Welcome to the presentation for our Story Plus project, Choose Your Words Carefully, which researched storytelling, Duke Magazine, and the university's Black community. Our project centers around content published in Duke Magazine, which was originally published as the Duke Alumni Register, but was rebranded as Duke Magazine in 1984. Even as the name, aesthetic, and perspectives in the magazine have changed, its mission has remained constant: to engage alumni in the life of the university through storytelling. This makes the magazine's archives a unique source of information about the university's perception of its function, its alumni, and the perspectives that the university anticipates the majority of its alumni to have. Articles published through Duke Magazine are reflections of how the university perceives the interest of its alumni community, and as such they offer insight on changes in alumni demographics, the shifting political landscape of the South, and, tellingly, shows how long the university has uplifted or excluded different groups of people. With such rich archives at our disposal, we decided to focus on three main questions. What story has the magazine been telling? Whose story has the magazine been sharing? And how has that story changed over time? In order to do this, we used textual analysis and archival resources to examine the magazine at different points in time. We noted the language used to describe Duke's Black community, as well as conversations about race at the national level, in order to examine how the university's stances have shifted over time. During our research, we coordinated our efforts over Zoom, text messages, and Google Drive documents. Though our process was much different than the face-to-face work we are accustomed to, we were able to communicate with each other across time zones and continents to work on this project together.
So we started off by reading Point of Reckoning, The Fight for Racial Justice at Duke University, to gain some context into Duke's road to desegregation. Our first time period, 1967 to 1980, was the height of the civil rights movement and a time of uncertain relations between racial and generation groups at Duke. This time period began with the silent vigil that saw widespread participation from many students on campus and the Allen Building takeover by Duke's Afro-American Society. We decided on 2000 to 2010 for our next decade, centering around the Duke lacrosse case, and finally 2016 to 2020 to cover the recent years, spanning the Trump era, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the George Floyd protests. So the March to May 1969 issue included on an interview feature of students of different backgrounds, a litmus test of sorts of their attitudes toward revolution, reform, and race relations. In fact, the silent majority of a white student body had not had much meaningful interaction with Black students. They were at best tolerated as a symbol of moral goodwill and expected to conform themselves to white upper middle class America. But Black students were definitely more cognizant of their Blackness and Black identity as a natural consequence of being so isolated in a white space, whereas it took the majority of the university's white constituents much longer to see whiteness as an identity, since it was the default state of everyday life. Along this blindness to whiteness was an equal blindness to the power imbalance between white university leaders and Black student leaders and organizations on campus. In the letters section of the March to May 1969 issue, the Reverend Stephen R. Moore, an alumnus, criticized an earlier issue of the magazine for publishing clearly one-sided coverage of a Black demonstration on campus. Although the magazine had criticized the disruptive nature of the protest, it had failed to recognize that the group of Black students was tried by an all-white jury, and that violent means were often the only ones available for a disadvantaged group to rattle the pervasive iron grip of the group in power. The administration's preferred modes of gradualism and diplomatic conversation rarely brought about change. Most of these events were covered from a white perspective, filtering the reader's view of Black students through an ever-present white lens. And occasionally, we do get to hear from a Black student who's ever so slightly outspoken. The May to June 2003 issue featured a face value portrait of Nikki Jusu, a Black woman and a Chronicle columnist on race relations. She expressed her disappointment with the homogeneity and relative contentment of the status quo she saw in the primarily white student body, and her steadfast commitment to be a Black columnist instead of just a columnist. But in the forum section of the following issue, one white alumnus reminded her that students in the 1950s voted as a student body at that time to end segregation and allow minorities of all races to attend Duke, implying that she was ungrateful for the groundwork that white people had done before her so that she could step onto campus. He further emphasizes his disapproval by stating his obligation to bring the voice of a white person into the magazine. He'd interpreted a single one-page instance of a Black student directly expressing their truthful experience of Duke as way too much. There seems to be an expectation from many white readers that they wish to make the morally correct decision on race issues, but would only consider doing so if their perspective was catered to at all times. And alumni were also given a platform to express their opposition to the construction of the Mary Lou Williams Center for Black Culture in lieu of an old dining room, reflecting Duke's own shaky commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion on campus. Recruiting a racially diverse class of students is one matter, but the task of creating an environment and space for their voices to stand on equal ground is usually neglected behind the statistics. Black students are expected to temper their own cultural identities and beliefs to promote more diverse and racially mixed circles on campus for the benefit of others.
When looking back at the moments captured in Duke magazine, both good and bad, it is necessary to remember that each artifact reveals its own unique facet of the truth. We covered time periods during moments of social change, and the articles written during these times are as likely to show optimistic, kind, and progressive thinking as they are to show some of the flawed mindsets of the past. It's important to remember that each article is written by a different person with different perspectives, and that often two or more writers in the same issue of the magazine can express very different perspectives. We must look at the articles both as distinct artifacts and as pieces in communication with each other. No one artifact can tell the whole story, and we must be mindful that progress is rarely linear and is never easy.
Reading through this magazine chronologically, we also began to see the weight of history looming in the issues of the present, or snapshots of many fluctuating presents. In the March to April 2001 issue, an article discussed reparations or repentance in response to the presence of affirmative action at universities and other societal institutions. While reparations traditionally invoke an image of financial compensation for wrongdoings, the issue becomes far less clear-cut when all the different parties involved have trouble agreeing upon a single narrative for the history of slavery in America and its resonating presence in the present. Stories of intergenerational trauma and poverty are not nearly as common as statistical studies on inner city schools and the criminal justice system, and they are not so easily quantifiable in the same way that recruitment numbers may be. Repentance itself is ingenuine if it only involves one-sided guilt and inaction from white America. It must be a component of ongoing communication and collaboration in race relations. In America, where talking directly about race is often considered impolite, there needs to be a point of reckoning with the living past in order to heal the wounds it continues to inflict. Part of that involves conscious action and listening and making space for more narratives to exist. And while some are wary of the emotion that speaking from an identity can bring into a piece, it is important to realize that the language of the detached academic default is not as unbiased as it would seem. These stories are very much shaped by a white perspective, hiding on the insidious veneer of the universal. And ultimately, the Duke magazine is hardly different from other written sources in that whiteness is the prevailing lens of historical records. In particular, its dual identities as a Southern institution and national university has largely meant that the multiracial history of the South was filtered through monoracial courthouse records and newspapers controlled by white men. Their narrative supersedes all others. Parsing through the Duke magazine and noting the relative racial and gender homogeneity of its editorial board emphasizes this point. So even instances of Black representation in the magazine are often passed through layers of digestibility or presented as subjects of debate for a white audience, a political issue. The newspaper medium itself is inseparable from white power. It is difficult to truly hear Black voices and perspectives in the Duke magazine, and their voices are likely better represented through oral history and Black-led publication.